So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Shawn. So I was born and raised in upstate New York. Lived there in New York until went to college in New York, and then moved away and actually moved overseas as a Peace Corps volunteer to Kenya for a couple of years, and then moved back and went to grad school in the Midwest and lived in a couple of other places, and found myself in Tallahassee almost 7 years ago.
Awesome. What have you been doing in Tallahassee for the last 7 years?
So here I am the president and CEO of the Southern Scholarship Foundation. We provide rent-free cooperative living housing for high-achieving students with financial need. So the foundation is statewide. We have houses in Fort Myers and Gainesville as well as Tallahassee.
That's awesome. Well, segueing a little bit, we have all faced our own set of adversities. You've been all around the world. I'm sure you've dealt with a lot of different things. Could you tell us a story about a time that maybe you faced an adversity? It might be unique to you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and really want to focus on where I was born and raised in upstate New York. And so I was, my parents divorced when I was very young, maybe 2 or 3 years old. And so basically raised by my mother. My father was around. I went to visit him every couple of weeks. But my sister and I were raised by our mother. And during that time, we lived in a trailer, mobile home park. And I remember waking up winter times, and my bed was up against a wall, and just near my head was an outlet. I can remember waking up and seeing frost inside the walls right around the outlet. It was very cold, and I remember other kids in the neighborhood that were in elementary school getting involved with drugs, substance abuse, and my most immediate neighbor, he was I think a year older than me, he was in and out of rehab a couple of times, but before I got in the 6th grade, he must have been in the 7th grade at that point. And just sort of being in that environment, and I don't know how the lessons sunk in when I was so young, but it was like, this is not an environment that I want to be in when I'm capable of providing for myself and family. And so, at some point in that journey, I just figured, no, I'm going to find a way out so that I'm not living in that when I'm older. And it was just like, it seemed like there were no rules. Kids would just do whatever they wanted, and come to find out later, I understood that my neighbor's mother was basically paying the rent by sleeping with the landlord. So it wasn't a great environment, I think, for kids to be in, but it was what my mother at the time could afford. And she certainly did all that she could to keep us on the right track.
Yeah, I can only imagine the perspective that gives you on life now. I'm very grateful for the childhood and the upbringing that I had. But I also, as someone who doesn't really know any different than having a steady roof over my head and coming home to a warm meal, I take for granted at times what I did have, right? And having conversations like this always kind of center me and make me realize that, like, what you had, not everyone has that. Like, that's not normal for everyone, what you had. This is a question I've asked before to another person we had on this. I'm just curious as to what advice would you give to someone like me that isn't necessarily aware of how good they have it?
I think exposure is really important. Being exposed to how other people live, and understanding it, as I think you're saying, that everybody comes with their own story, their own set of experiences. My lived experience is not your lived experience. Yeah, yours is not, the person who's in the building next door. We're each coming in, and even that goes for people who, live on the same cul-de-sac. And in neighboring houses, what happens in one house is going to be very different from what happens in the other, and how they're parented, and how extended family are involved in their lives. I mean, all of those things factor into lived experience. I had another experience, and it's not really an adversity, but I mentioned going into the Peace Corps and living in Kenya. My first time around was for 2 years there. That was vastly different than anything I had experienced. And my first, when I was there, my first 3 months, I was in training, learning the language and learning the culture and learning what I would be doing as a volunteer. And during that 3 months, I stayed with a family in a room that they had in their house dedicated for volunteers that would come through. They had 8 children from 2 years old to 16 years old. They had no electricity. They had access to a well so they could get water. They had a little compound, a wooden house. All the children shared one room. I had my own room, and then the parents had their room. But and then they had farm animals around. It was a sort of a subsistence life, but it was so rich in their family life. They were just so close with each other, and then close with the community too. And I picked up on that when I spent all of that time there. That's their experiences, and it just like stripped away from me all the notions I had about what family was, the way I was raised by being inside of this other family. So, that's pretty intense experience. So, finding ways to get exposure to other people and how they live, that could be done here, within the local community too. And obviously not living in somebody else's house for 3 months, but just getting to know people who live in a different part of town, or a different part of the county.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the stories are eye-opening, let alone living in those moments and being there. And I can only imagine, again, the perspectives that has given you on life, having grown up in the situation you did, gone to Kenya, you said, and then now being successful in Tallahassee. That is quite the story. It is quite the pathway. And you did it yourself. You did it through hard work, and you got out of a situation that sadly a lot of people really, really struggle to get out of. I think one thing that stands out to me is you spoke on earlier is how early you had the mindset of, this is not the way I want to grow up. A lot of people, and even in the stories that we've done in the past, I've noticed a lot of people for a long period of time don't realize that they have it as bad as they do, or they don't, because they don't know any different, right? What would you say to those kids that don't really know any better, aren't motivated to go get exposure to these things? What advice would you give to them, having been through your experience?
I think it's to ask themselves what it is they want, what kind of lifestyle they want for themselves, and if they have a family, if that family, or if they hope to one day have a family. But what is that lifestyle? What does that look like for them? I knew for me early on, it was the way I recognized I would get there was through education, and so I was first in my family to go to college. And I just knew I was on the college path. I didn't know what was entailed with that in the details at the time, but I knew the college path was the way I was going to go. And to have a nice house in a good neighborhood, and so that my children would be more comfortable. I could provide for them a more comfortable environment, safer environment than the one that I had grown up in. So I think, it's really just asking that and being honest with themselves in that answer as well. What do I want that lifestyle to look like? And really, accepting that. And then, okay, that's the long term. How do I get there?
Yeah.
Is it through education? Is it through learning a trade, apprenticing for something, to learn those skills that will help them reach that level of life. And what do they not want?
Yeah.
Because I think mine was rooted in what I knew what I didn't want, and as I grew awareness, I realized what it is I wanted.
Yeah, and it's a different way to look at it, where you want to be, like what you want to get to. But looking at what you don't like and what you don't want to be there long term, I think is just as important as looking at the positives, looking at the negatives too, and trying to weed all of those into something that you can truly be happy about when you're older. So thank you so much for telling your story.